Hello everybody, my name is Azadi. I'm a PhD candidate working at AWP Materials Testing Group of University of Kaiserslautern, and I'm going to present a talk on fatigue behavior of nanostructured bainite that is part of our ongoing research work. The outline of the presentation is shown here. First, an introduction on the microstructure and its mechanical properties, then the research scheme covering the objective and the methodology of the work, and eventually the results that can be discussed in 3 sections, including the fatigue testing, the notch design, and the microstructural analysis of the crack path.
The microstructure is called nanostructured bainite. This diagram represents the position of the nanobainitic steels as compared to the other steel grades in terms of the strength and ductility. As can be seen, the microstructure shows an outstanding mechanical properties that makes it a promising steel grade for commercial applications, for example, in production of large parts such as milling machines or in production of high-pressure injection systems.
The TEM micrograph of the nanostructured bainite can be observed, and the microstructural features are accordingly shown. We have the bainitic ferrite having the BCC crystal structure in the form of the plates with an average thickness of 20 to 40 nanometer, and also the heterogeneous regions of retained austenite having the FCC crystal structure. The heat treatment route through which the bainitic transformation is carried out is shown using this diagram, where the microstructure is heated up to the temperature range of 890 to 950 degrees C for the sake of austenitization, followed by cooling down to an isothermal temperature where the bainitic transformation occurs. It's been stated that the nanoscale bainitic ferrite features that are achieved through the relatively low temperatures bring high value of strength to the microstructure, and the ductility is due to the composite behavior of the microstructure coming from the presence of retained austenite, particularly the film-like retained austenite features. This schematic illustration of a grain will be explained further in depth later on. Using these 2 diagrams, it can be described whether there is a correlation between the static and the in-service properties of the nanostructured bainite. On the left-hand side, we have the plot of the yield strength against the plate thickness, where we can rule out that the reduction in the plate thickness gives rise to the higher values of the yield strength. However, on the right-hand side, where we have the fatigue strength plot against the plate thickness fails to explain the fatigue performance. Considering that the in-service durability of a component is limited by the fatigue performance rather than the static properties, the motivation for the research on the understanding of the relationship between the microstructure and the in-service properties can be readily understood.
Hence, I will describe the microstructure from crystallographic standpoint. Generally speaking, in nanobainitic steels, it's been found that there is orientation relationship between the parent austenite phase and its product bainitic ferrite, which forms a so-called hierarchical structure. The schematic illustration over here shows a prior austenite grain and the bainitic ferrite features in the form of blocks and packets. A bainitic block can be formed when bainitic ferrite plates of either the same variant or of 2 variants that are misoriented by a small angle aggregates. In addition, a packet contains adjacent bainitic blocks with a plane of family 110 to be parallel to the same particular plane 111 of the parent austenite.
The methodology of a former work developed by Professor Kerscher, Dr. Morales-Rivas, and their collaborators will be briefly explained in the next 2 slides, where the analysis of the crack path was carried out using a geometry containing a blunt notch in which the notch sensitivity is low. However, the objective of the current research is to analyze the influence of the microstructure during the short fatigue crack propagation by means of a prefabricated physically short notch that behaves as a sharp crack. Here we have the SEM micrograph of a nanobainitic steel having a chemical composition as written down here, subjected to the tensile fatigue test. What we see is the cross-section perpendicular to the fracture surface. The crack initiated at point A at the surface, and the part of the crack path correspond to that cross-section is shown here. In order to get the crystallographic information out of the scanned area, the electron backscatter diffraction technique was employed in order to generate the crystal orientation map of the aforementioned area, in which the colors assigned to each grain can be interpreted using an inverse pole figure color-coded key associated with the EBSD map. The results of the trace analysis along the crack path are shown here for the bainitic ferrite features. For this part of the crack path from point A to C, we see that the traces having the highest Schmidt factor value perfectly overlap with the crack profile itself, verifying that the crack deflected along the activated slip systems. That is the theory of the stage 1 of the crack propagation. In addition, it can be seen that the bainitic block features are the crystallographic parameters controlling the crack propagation at the stage 1 of the crack growth.
The chemical composition used in this study is shown here. The heat treatment includes the austenitization at 990 degrees C, and the bainitic transformation was done at 250 degrees C for 14 hours. The fatigue specimens with the geometry shown here were manufactured having quite a small dimension in order to provide quasi-in situ microstructural analysis. The mechanical properties of the alloy are written in the box, and the tensile fatigue tests were carried out on fatigue specimens after inducing a notch behaving as a short crack by means of focused ion beam technique in order to define the crack initiation point practically, and also to analyze the crack path within the short crack regime where the local microstructure governed the fatigue performance. I will make use of the Kitagawa diagram in order to explain the notch design. That is a significant step in our research work since we want to make sure that we are within the short crack regime. As mentioned before, that's where the local microstructure governs the fatigue behavior. The diagram initially combines the fatigue endurance limit and the fatigue long crack growth threshold as a single plot. Intersection of two lines defines a node as a material parameter independent of the crack dimension. And in practice, there should be a gradual transition from the endurance limit towards the long crack propagation threshold, since the experimental data don't agree with the area over here and tend to follow this trend. RFIB notch was designed according to the normalized form of the Kitagawa diagram proposed by Azadi. Using this diagram, the fatigue strength of the notched specimens can be calculated using equation 1 as here, where the parameters are defined in details in this box. According to the sketch, our notch was designed to be within the physically short crack regime, where the effect of local microstructure along with the influence of the notch geometry are included. In addition, being within the physically short crack regime provides us with the possibility to study the complex process that might involve during the damage event, that is, the feasibility of the simultaneous multiple crack initiation and crack growth. In practice, a physically short crack of a length of 80 micron and a depth of 30 micron, as can be seen here, was obtained by means of focused ion beam technique. The notch was induced at the edge of a flat fatigue specimen that was introduced before within the gauge section. Therefore, we are within the physically short crack regime, and the selected notch dimensions corresponds to the point A are above the fatigue strength. Therefore, we can expect to have crack initiation and propagation at the selected stress values.
The SEM micrograph generated in the backscattered mode shows the overview of the crack path after the interrupted fatigue test. The total length of the crack is approximately 100 micron, and the crack path can be divided into 3 sections, where in section 1 and in section 3 a straight crack growth can be observed, meaning that the crack propagates normal to the direction of the applied load. However, in section 2, a multiple crack initiation can be inferred. Looking at section 2 at a higher magnification, the crack initiation seems to resemble the so-called unpassant cracks, where the tips of the parallel cracks tend to grow towards each other. In addition, specifically at this high magnification, the crack deflection is done mainly by the bainitic ferrite features shown in white, where the crystal contrast comes from the backscattered electrons. In the last 3 slides, the theory whether or not the crack path propagates through the active slip systems will be discussed. To do so, the EBSD data with regard to the crack path was gathered and the crystal orientation map of the bainitic ferrite and austenite was superimposed in this way on the SEM micrographs of the phases. Therefore, the features through which the crack path was deflected were identified and marked as numbers in the next slide.
In the table, the Euler angles and the maximum Schmidt factor for each section is represented, and among all possible traces, the one with highest Schmidt factor values was obtained and subsequently was computed, and the resultant traces are plotted here with respect to the crack path. It can be seen that in section 1 and section 3 there is not one-to-one match between the crack path and the selected trace, while there is a precise overlap between the crack path and the traces in section 2 for points 6, 7, 8, and 9. Also, a uniaxial stress is supposed to be applied in theory during the fatigue test. Based on the results of the trace analysis, it can be seen that only in section 2 the uniaxiality applies, where the crack propagates along the single slip bands with maximum Schmidt factor. However, in section 1, the presence of the FIB notch might affect the stress state, and also in section 3, the stage 2 of the crack growth might occur.
The trace analysis for points 6 to 10 correspond to the section 2 of the crack path that already was represented in a previous slide will be described here in details. Starting from the section 6, the whole traces correspond to the slip plane 110 for the bainitic ferrite were plotted, and among all, the theoretically activated pair of the plane directions through which the crack growth was identified from the EBSD data. The process was repeated for points 7 to 9, where the selected traces, as can be seen, overlapped the crack profile as mentioned before. However, in point 10, that the crack deflected at a relatively large block of austenite, the overlap cannot be seen, since the austenite is a softer phase than bainitic ferrite inherently. Hence, the plastic deformation occurs easier in austenite than in ferrite, meaning that not necessarily the hypothesis of the single slip system activation is valid here.
To conclude, it can be said that talking about the stage 1 means the crack propagates along the active slip systems after initiation. The active slip bands can be predicted by the critical resolve shear stress described by Schmidt's law. In section 2 of the crack path, the crack deflection along the bainitic features follows the stage 1 of the crack propagation. However, for the part of the crack deflected by the austenite, this theory didn't verify. As an ongoing work, the notch triaxiality and its effect on the crack path in section 1 should be studied. In addition, in section 3, whether the crack propagation follows the stage 2 of the crack growth will be analyzed.
Thank you for your attention.